Hi, I'm going to be talking about the elasticity of demand. But before we talk about that, we first have to talk about the law of demand, which states that consumers will be willing to buy more or less of a product depending on a price change. It also tells us how sensitive consumers are to that price change. Using this, we can divide goods into two main categories: elastic and inelastic goods. Elastic goods have relatively flat slopes. This is because any change in price has a relatively large effect on the demand curve. A perfectly elastic good has a completely horizontal demand curve. This means that any change in price will cause all the consumers to no longer want to buy the product. However, the opposite is true of the inelastic good. Inelastic goods have a relatively steep slope, which means any change in price has a relatively small effect on the demand curve. Perfectly inelastic goods have a completely vertical slope, which means that any change in price will have no effect on the quantity that consumers will want to buy. However, it's important to note that both perfectly inelastic goods and perfectly elastic goods are only theoretical, because in our world today, no good exists where you would pay infinite amount of money for or buy an infinite quantity of. Alright, next we're going to be looking at ways to determine whether a good is inelastic or elastic. One of the tests we can use is the total revenue test. This tells us that as price increases and total revenue increases, or as price decreases and total revenue decreases, we have a good that is inelastic. However, if a price increases and total revenue decreases, or price decreases and total revenue increases, we have a good that is elastic. We can also look at the qualities of inelastic and elastic goods to determine what they are. For example, an inelastic good has few substitutes. It's oftentimes a must-have or a necessity, and it's also many times inexpensive. However, an elastic good has many substitutes. It's a luxury good, and it's oftentimes very expensive. What we also must remember is that the more the time passes, the more elastic a good becomes. The final test we can use is the coefficient test. The equation for this test is ED is equal to the percent change in quantity over the percent change in price. Now, if ED is less than 1, we know that our good is inelastic. However, if ED is greater than 1, we have a good that is elastic. But if ED is equal to 1, we have a new situation called unit elastic. Unit elastic is when a change in price causes an equal percent change in the demand curve. This has no effect on the total revenue. Finally, we can look at the elasticity on the demand curve. At a typical demand curve, the top portion is always elastic, and the bottom portion is always inelastic. And the portion where the demand curve goes from elastic to inelastic, we call unit elastic.